Welcome to the realm where reality meets imagination, where perception and storytelling converge. I am your guide on this cinematic journey, a voyage that transcends the boundaries of time and space. Today we embark with the most remarkable instrument at a filmmaker's disposal, the lens. This unassuming piece of glass holds the power to reveal worlds within worlds. To uncover the rich tapestry of all our lives, to reveal a story that resonates deep within our souls. Just as a microscope delves into the hidden world of the minuscule, or a telescope transports us to the cosmic expanse, the camera lens merely gazes into the essence of our humanity. A filmmaker is much like an investigator exploring a crime scene, observing the facts and data, clues, photographs, and testimonies. In this case, to uncover the truth about the most investigated relic in the history of humankind, the Shroud of Turin.
If I were to ask you just point blank, why is Robert Oрландо making a book and a film on the Shroud of Turin of all things? Why would you do that?
For me, it was a way, a vehicle to test that for myself. So because I write stories and make films and try and get to the bottom of biographies, these are my tools. So I thought, why not do it as a project where I could track my efforts and then turn it into a narrative and use my first-person narrative as a way to maybe inspire some people to do it and be willing to live with the results where I landed.
Who do you say that I am? Who do you say that I am?
The twin was on.
Christmas Eve, 2021. My father was recovering in the hospital from a fall. I had just ignored another offer to look into doing a project on the Shroud. Then out of nowhere, my father died. Questions show care, they show curiosity, they show concern, and rarely they show free. His essence and the legacy he left. The suddenness of his death raised questions that required an answer. Soon after, another friend asked me again to confront the shroud, a subject where others seem to only have partial answers. Frankly, as an author, filmmaker, and one immersed in biblical studies, I'd never really been interested in looking at the so-called burial cloth. Well, what if this was the shroud that covered Jesus? In the heart of a bustling town, I found myself adrift, lost in the wake of my father's sudden departure. Once the world of books and films offered me solace, but now they seem shallow. In search of a new direction, I turned to my faith, revisiting the teachings I absorbed as a child. One day, as I delved through the pages of old books within a dusty library, I stumbled upon a mention of the Shroud of Turin. They say it holds the image of Jesus Christ, imprinted on his burial cloth. My next thought was to take some initial steps toward an investigation. There was a small center out in California with a collection of the shroud. It was time to visit the scene of the crime for myself.
Judea is a Roman province. Nobody has the authority of capital punishment except the governor, Pontius Pilate. That's it.
Step 1, secure the scene. First, create a protective boundary around the crucial evidence, just like drawing a protective line around a crime scene.
Golgotha means the place of the skull, and one fascinating but troubling possibility about that name is that it was called place of the skull because there were skulls of human beings there.
Somebody who claims to be a king in a realm where he couldn't possibly be the king and is some kind of threat to the existing ruler.
What do we know from the image itself about what that man suffered? If we were to walk through the Passion, what could you know about his scourging? What could you know about the crowning? What could you know about the moment they transfer the body from the ground to the cross?
It was absolutely torturous. It was pushed to the maximum.
He died on that cross, as the other two men crucified with him also did. Their bodies were taken down before sunset.
By sundown, they have to get him in the tomb by sundown. And what that means is that they were able to do preliminary spices in the winding sheet, etc., but not enough. This is why the women are coming back on Sunday morning.
All I could hear was the same voice. Who do you say I am?
They come back with spices ready to anoint Jesus, but he's gone.
What the skeptic would say is that, of course, the shroud matches the biblical account because the biblical account is what the forger is using to make the painting.
E i Vangeli sono importanti per la sindone perché solo i Vangeli ci possono dire chi è l'uomo della sindone.
What no one can deny is that they believed it to have occurred. And this revolution of belief, which we know to this day.
Combining an empty tomb with appearances of Jesus to them, convinced that he was resurrected. The shroud could be a piece of physical evidence in favor of the resurrection event itself.
The painful part, I knew, was some truths require suffering.
For sure, in the eyes of the skeptics, Jesus was a historical figure, that's undoubted.
I think there's no doubt at all that Jesus is a historical figure. I think that the kind of hyper-skepticism that denies that Jesus existed would actually end up denying that many people in history existed, because you only make an impact in antiquity on your culture through the memories of other people. Because if you haven't got photographs and if you haven't got writings left behind, the impact you leave, like Jesus, is on your followers, and that's how you impact history. So to say, well, we haven't got enough evidence that Jesus existed as a human being in the first century, you might as well say that many other people that we know lived didn't exist.
There is a first century historical Jesus, and I am convinced, as are most so-called experts, that we know a great deal about this person. We also know this person was executed by the Romans and was crucified. So that much, all but a handful of people agree upon. For me, that's not an interesting issue. The issue isn't did Jesus exist. The interesting question is how much do we know about him?
The evidence is overwhelming. We have within one generation 3 biographies. We have somebody else whose letters nobody disputes. That's Paul. He knew family members. He knows the brother of Jesus, James.
Then after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to get acquainted with Cephas and stayed with him 15 days. I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother. I assure you before God that what I am writing you is no lie.
And so this is not some airbrushed fairy tale or something like this. This is hard-hitting, in the streets, realism. He knows James. And as a skeptic, by the way, once said, if Jesus didn't exist, you'd think his brother James would have known that.
We have historical snippets. It's a very high Christology. Jesus is worshipped, he's sitting on the right hand of God. When you bring the history in, you bring the shroud in, that was archaeology. These are puzzle pieces to help you put your jigsaw puzzle together.
The problem you've always got with the historical Jesus is he didn't leave anything behind. We haven't got his writings, we haven't got his carpentry that he did. But then suddenly, we apparently have his burial shroud. So it gives us tangible evidence of something that was close to Jesus, literally right next to Jesus. So that's one of the things that makes it so potentially exciting, and also what makes it so potentially disappointing if it isn't his burial shroud.
It's Mary Magdalene who is there at the tomb. What's her backstory? She has 7 demons, and then Christ casts them out. And so she is obviously devoted to our Lord in a way that is very, very special. She's there at the foot of the cross when so many aren't. She witnessed, in other words, his torture, his death. This is critical. Just like John, by the way, who was also at the foot of the cross. He saw both phases, the before and the after. He saw him suffer, he saw him die, and he saw him laid in the tomb. These were the witnesses to the death, to the burial, and now they see him rise again.
We examine pieces under a magnifying glass. We inspect fingerprints, DNA, and other material evidence to uncover hidden connections, much like assembling puzzle fragments to reveal the complete image.
The first thing I would do is I would observe that there are some things in the Gospels that don't seem like Christians would have made them up. So, for example, Jesus, according to some, was a glutton and a drunkard. I don't think early Christians sat around and said, let's think of something to say about our Savior. Oh, people thought he was, a drunkard and he was a glutton. Or there's a passage in which his family appears to think he's out of his mind. I don't think they invented that. So you can go through the Gospels and you can show any number of things in here that look like memory, and you can't come up with a credible story for why somebody would have invented this, somebody who is promoting Jesus's cause and thinks he's Lord and so on. The number of those things is actually fairly surprising to me, and if those things are memory, they're the proof that there must be other memories, because it's wildly unlikely that early Christians only remembered the things that might trouble them or that might be potentially embarrassing or things that they would never think up from scratch.
Jesus is crucified on Friday night. The Sabbath was a high feast day that day. They would have been interested to tuck Jesus away in the tomb probably before the third star in the sky appears and the Sabbath rest descends upon them. And so they're, quickly racing to tuck that tomb away. Maybe they've left the aloes and other oils that they would have used to anoint the body. They're going to do that in a second moment. They say, let's go. And they tuck him in the tomb. And then, of course, it's the women we read about that early on Sunday morning, after the Sabbath has ended, now they're coming to finish what they started. Except they can't, because they discover that the stone is rolled away and the body isn't there. All that remains are the wrappings. And this is what they discover, Peter and John, as they walk into the tomb. The moment that you read in John chapter 20, when Peter and John come racing to the tomb and they find in a first moment these cloths lying inside of the sepulcher, there's no indication, at least in his text, that says, oh, they saw an image impressed on the cloth and for that reason they believed. It does say he saw and believed, but unfortunately, it doesn't tell us what he saw so that he believed. Something about the condition of the tomb suggested belief.
This is not just any old artifact or relic, we might have some curiosity about or something. This could go right to the heart of the Christian message, what Christian faith is all about, which is the resurrection of Jesus.
Well, if the Turin Shroud is real, then it corroborates all sorts of details in the gospel narrative. Jesus being pierced in his side with a spear, Jesus being crucified with nails in his hands and his feet, Jesus being scourged, Jesus wearing a crown of thorns. All of these things are found in the four Gospels in the New Testament, and there they are on the shroud. So the shroud becomes like a fifth gospel. It's witnessing to the very things that you've got in the four canonical Gospels.
I spent a lot of time in the library. I was amassing facts and analyzing arguments, weighing them against the ancient Bible testimony. A whole world started to open up, and I knew in order to be thorough, I would need to begin with the past and develop a real timeline.
You see the trek that it went from Jerusalem area, 30-ish AD, up straight north to King Abdar.
And so there it is in those very early years, in the first half of the first century. But the problem is that even though Abgar, when he venerates the shroud, according to this legend, and is thereby healed of his leprosy, he converts to Christianity, and so do a pocket of Christians that are flourishing there in Edessa for a time.
during the Crusades, there were the wars between Christians and Muslims. When people say, well, how come the shroud's in such good shape? They can say, time out. Mummies are older than the shrouds, and you'd be surprised how decent we can tell things from mummy cloth. Well, they add to that by saying that the shroud was locked into the gate, and they had it hid for a few hundred years.
It's not until there's a flood in 525, and now they're reconstructing the city walls in 544, that they rediscover out of a niche in the city wall what is purported to be the Shroud of Turin.
And then the theory is that the Knights Templar, armed with swords, fought in battles, brought the shroud back to Italy. And with a little bit of jockeying around up there in northern Italy, and the corner of France is right there, the corner of Switzerland's right there. With a little bit of that, it's pretty much been in Turin since it's been theorized that it was brought back to Europe.
With uncertainty guiding me, I immerse myself in the study of the shroud. My investigative instincts awaken, drawn by the challenge of unraveling its mysteries. Scholars, scientists, and theologians would become my guides, each presenting their theories on the shroud's authenticity. As I dig deeper, skepticism becomes fascination, and I'm consumed by the desire to uncover its truth firsthand. It was time to meet with a true shroud expert, all the way from Rome.
What is crucifixion? Crucifixion is the summum supplicium. It's the worst of all punishments that the Romans devised so as to communicate to all, don't do what this guy did or get ready to suffer the same thing.
I headed to the Society of Biblical Literature, where thousands of Bible scholars gathered annually. There I had the chance to interview some of the world's greatest experts.
As far back as we can go with the shroud, people were claiming it was Jesus's. There's no chance this was somebody else, some random person's.
It would have been an object of political power. You got the shroud, okay, this is a political artifact.
Well, there's a very sketchy history of this shroud. Who owns it, where is it, and so on, when it finally comes to light. And I think it was ignored. I mean, Protestants would ignore it. They'd say, oh, this is just one more Catholic relic. I mean, they got the bones of Peter and the Apostle John and John the Baptist and everything else. But naturally, somebody has his burial shroud, of course.
It's really important to remember that the Middle Ages was teeming with relics. It was teeming with them. So we have teeth of the young Jesus and some of Mary's breast milk, and we have thorns from the crown of thorns. We have a lot of things. We have more than one shroud, too.
The image is not a scorch. It's not paint. There are no pigments. It's not some kind of a stain. And then, well, if it's a negative, could light be involved? And that's when we jump from, oh, this is a medieval forgery, to we're now talking 20th century science to try to explain this thing?
As I dug deeper into the mysteries of the shroud, my understanding began to change. The image imprinted on the cloth, so hauntingly lifelike, seemed to defy all conventional explanations. I concluded only an intense radiation of light might be the key. It was an extraordinary hypothesis, but the more I delved into it, the more it seemed to align with the peculiar characteristics of the shroud. This discovery had staggering implications. Could the intense radiation of light explain not only the image on the shroud, but also the resurrection itself? Was it possible that this relic held within it a source of energy released during a divine event? I moved forward to uncover the truth behind the resurrection claim, but I needed guidance. My search led me to a quaint town in Lynchburg, nestled in Virginia, home to a world-renowned expert on the resurrection, Dr. Gary Habermas, a name that resonated in scholarly circles. He possessed a wealth of knowledge about the mixing of faith and science. Sitting on his cozy patio, we got acquainted. Then I was met with the shelves upon shelves of ancient texts, manuscripts, and scientific journals. The room seemed to radiate the aura of profound wisdom.
If you're going to be bothered because I'm talking about God and you're an atheist, if you're going to be bothered, you will find a way to explain away every piece of data. Worldviews determine what we believe more than facts do.
Our discussion led us to the heart of the matter, the resurrection. Dr. Habermas's words resonated deeply as he spoke of an event that transcended the boundaries of human comprehension.
When you get a definition of the gospel, deity, death, resurrection of Jesus. No matter Catholic, Protestant, just read the New Testament. And Paul checked it out. He went to the guys who were, we'd say, the horse's mouth, Peter, James, and John. Where do you get closer to the eyewitnesses than right here?
The very concept of life reawakening from death was a mystery that defied the constraints of reason and would confound any modern worldview. As the hours passed, more clarity began to emerge. The possibility of extreme radiation of light as the catalyst for the image on the shroud and possibly even the resurrection itself. This held profound implications. As I left his home, I was armed with a renewed sense of purpose, an unshakable determination to uncover the intertwining mysteries that had captivated my heart and mind. The journey ahead promised to be nothing short of a pilgrimage that would test my beliefs and possibly reshape my assumptions of reality itself.
On the shroud, it's a photographic negative in an age where they knew nothing about photographic negatives. How in the world do you have a photographic negative image of a dead person on a cloth like that without any knowledge of photographic negatives? I mean, the whole journey that made this a modern search for the truth about this particular shroud of Torino is when in the 19th century the French started taking pictures of the shroud, and then they developed the negative, and then and they look in the negative and they're going, oh my goodness, look at this image of a real person. The negative is the positive, and the positive is the negative. How in the world did that happen?
I traveled back in history and was locked in the year 1898 with a man called Secondo Pia. Secondo was born in Asti, Piedmont in 1855. An attorney by trade, he was deeply interested in both art and science. He began to explore a new branch of study: photography. Pia is considered a pioneer in photography using electric light bulbs in the 1890s. But it was only an accident that Secondo Pia would take the first step in the field of modern syndenology. In 1898, Turin was selected to host an Italian Arts and Culture Festival. Esposizione Generale Italiana. As part of the celebration, a sacred art exhibition was planned. The head of the Shroud Commission, Baron Monod, petitioned the king for a public display of the shroud and asked for the right to photograph the cloth in order to promote the exhibition. The king agreed. Naturally, Secondo Pio was named the official photographer. In the days leading up to the exhibition, Pio took the first photograph of the shroud, but he couldn't believe what he had discovered when he began to develop a black and white negative.
And the discovery that the image on the shroud, the reason it looks so mysterious and ghostly, is it's a negative. And so they take a photograph and they look at the negative of the photograph, and now the image is a positive. And that is what caught everyone's attention, like, how in the world?
It was a very dramatic moment when he published the negative. Because with that negative, you suddenly see something that looks like a real human being's face. And it looks much more like a real human being's face than it does when you look at the shroud with the naked eye.
Look at this image of a real person. The negative is the positive, and the positive is the negative. How in the world did that happen? And the best theory is that originally, when the shroud, when he was wrapped in the shroud, and there was myrrh and aloe and pistic nard and other spices, what happened is that there was some light burst that imprinted his image on the shroud.
That one photograph alone galvanized the scientific community. As a photographer myself, I was hooked.
And I think one of the reasons for the enduring power of the shroud as an image is that that picture is so striking.
I chiari e gli scuri. Ecco che perché l'immagine sul negativo fotografico appare più chiara, più naturale. Questa fu la grande scoperta, che quindi diede anche l'inizio, diede il via alla storia scientifica della sindone. Perché avere in mano una fotografia voleva dire poterla studiare in qualunque momento, ingrandirla, e quindi gli studi scientifici sulla sindone sono proprio partiti da quella fotografia.
It's not until 1931 that a professional photographer by the name of Giuseppe Enrie takes the same photo on orthochromatic film, very famous photos that now reach the hands of Yves Delage, a skeptic, a non-believer who is in Paris, who writes for the Académie des Sciences. And he writes a paper studying, again, the pathologies of the man of the shroud, comparing them to what we know about Jesus of Nazareth. His conclusion is that the man of the shroud is Jesus of Nazareth. He's not making any faith claims when he says so. He's simply just looking at the data, asking, who is this man? What has he endured? Who is he likely to be? They won't publish his paper in the minutes of the Académie des Sciences. He's laughed out of the scientific community.
Although I had the image, I still did not have a history or a timeline of how the shroud went from Jerusalem to modern Turin. Sometimes it would appear and disappear, sometimes for substantial, incredible reasons, other times for reasons we don't know.
We're not saying that there are dozens and dozens and dozens of authentic relics about Jesus. You've got this one that stands out from all the others. And you have to say, it's always plausible that at least one maker of one of these relics would do a really, really great job. The same thing is true with modern forgeries. Most of them are absolutely terrible, and you can see them straight away. But every now and then, someone produces a forgery so good that people really believe it. So what I think is the case is, by definition, if it's a forgery, it's a very good one, because if it wasn't, nobody would be looking at it.
Many shroud researchers have recorded that a forgery could only be the work of an evil genius.
The shroud first turns up for definite in the 14th century, and we do have accounts of it from this church in France, and the earliest accounts do suggest that people thought that it was a forgery.
The crucifixion victim is naked and has been whipped and beaten from the back of the neck all the way across the back, the buttocks, the backs of the legs, right down to the calves. Nobody depicted art like that.
This is not like any medieval painting of the death of Jesus. Not Grunewald, not El Greco, nothing.
The thing that does genuinely horrify me is the thought that the victim of the shroud is somebody from the medieval period who was tortured like that. I mean, that's one of the most horrific thoughts, that the forger went to all of that trouble, you know, with a real corpse. I mean, that is pretty scary thought.
Non potevano immaginare che un cadavere fosse posto in una stoffa così preziosa, cadavere di un crocifisso. Poi, i pollini della Palestina, l'aragonite uguale a quella delle grotte di Gerusalemme. Per quale motivo il falsario avrebbe messo queste microparticelle non visibili a occhio nudo quando il microscopio non esisteva?
And the best explanation for this correspondence of the image with the first century evidence, lack of correspondence with medieval evidence, argues strongly in favor of its authenticity.
You can believe whatever you like about the historical authenticity of the shroud, and yet at the same time, it is wonderful that we have an archaeological object, which just so happens to be the most studied archaeological object in the history of the world, that attests to the core of our faith, both incarnation and resurrection.
Without the possibility of the shroud being a painting, and a reenactment seeming like an outlandish theory, that left only the written testimony of one pope and the carbon dating results.
The carbon dating results from the 1980s, and I think 3 different laboratories were involved in testing the shroud, and they decided that this linen that they were looking at was from the 14th or late 13th century, if I recall correctly. Okay, so that's what some very sophisticated scientists say. Now, I don't know anything about carbon dating, but I can tell you what they said.
Science could possibly study the image and figure out the age of the cloth. While the timeline was not seamless by any means, the greatest hurdle to overcome was the carbon dating.
The golden standard for dating organic material is carbon dating. I think that has to be said.
I had to slow down my investigation. I would set up talks with Father Dalton in Princeton so we can engage with the audience. That's when I would gain more facts and start to see the holes in the skeptic's case.
In the very first text that refers to the Shroud of Turin, we find a bishop writing to one of the French popes. And the bishop says, I know a bishop who knew the person who painted this, and he confessed to it. The Pope said, okay, it's okay to revere this as an artistic image. You can display it, but you can't tell people it's the real deal. The first indisputable evidence we have says it is a forgery and dates it to exactly the time that the carbon dating dated it to.
Okay, so let's steel man this objection for a second and just say, look, that's really good argument against the authenticity of the shroud. We have a bishop who writes a letter to the Holy Father saying that he knows the man who made this as the work of a con artist, and he's confessed to it. And the Holy Father writes back to say, you can put this on display, you can have people look at it, and perhaps they remember and recall the events of Christ's Passion, but just don't tell them that this is the real deal, the authentic item that came, that wrapped the body of Jesus many, many years ago. And that coincides with what carbon dating has to say, right? It's carbon dated to be from the 13th, 14th century, thereabouts. That's got to be more than a coincidence, come on.
I saw the London Standard, and it had on the front of it carbon dating of the Turin Shroud. And I went and I bought a copy, and I remember the sinking disappointment. And the fact I was disappointed actually proved to me that I obviously really did want to believe, if you know what I mean. It wasn't, I was searching. It's one of those things where I don't come to my skepticism happily.
They took a strip in 1988, they diced it up and gave it to 3 laboratories, Oxford, Arizona, and Zurich. It came back to be from 1260 to 1390. Of this, they were 95% sure. In other words, beyond a shadow of a doubt.
3 things come to mind. I think we know that the shroud was in a fire.
Problem of the fire of Chambéry. The shroud was caught in a fire. Of course, a lot of smoke is going to be absorbed into the cloth, and not just where the burn areas are, but the carbons that is there, it's going to be absorbed into the cloth. And so again, you're going to have an extra abundance of C14.
The shroud was scorched in a fire in the Middle Ages. And the question is, what piece of the shroud was tested for carbon-14? So far as I know this for a fact, they wouldn't allow any of the image to be tested.
You have another problem, is after that fire of Chambéry, some sisters actually put through what appears to be invisible mending, tried to take cotton fibers, and they dyed them with a medieval dye, a gum dye mordant that was available only in medieval Europe for the first time. And of course, they wove it into the spot where the exact sample was taken. So this is problematic.
2, I know that they use the very edge of the fringe of the shroud, and that they already know that as you move closer toward the center, the years vary and even go back in time.
La differenza progressiva da una parte all'altra di 150 anni è troppo per la rappresentatività del campione.
They didn't tell you this in 1988. A 200-year difference between 2 centimeters, and there's this gradation as you move from left to right. It gets progressively younger. Say, hey, what happens if we extrapolate and we keep moving to the right? If I get 4.4 meters to the right, do I get a date in the future? They don't tell you any of this. They just tell you, front page news, the shroud is a medieval fake, it doesn't pertain to Jesus of Nazareth, and that was enough.
Because the way the shroud was handled over time, people would hold it up as a holy relic, their fingers would be all over it, there'd be more fungus.
Nel passato la prova del carbonio 14 era usata dai negatori per dire che la sindone è falsa, è del Medioevo. La sindone non è un buon campione per la datazione radiocarbonica, perché se tu hai un osso o un pezzo di legno puoi prelevare all'interno un punto non contaminato, ma la sindone è tutta a contatto con l'ambiente.
The old technology now is actually not even as good as the new technology in carbon dating, and at some points in carbon dating will even be looked at as inaccurate.
The only evidence that we have of someone being crucified with a crown of thorns is Jesus. It's the only one. There's no question that as far back as we can go with the shroud, people were claiming it was Jesus's. There's no chance this was somebody else, some random person's shroud.
I ventured to Rome and then tour in Italy, first to a museum and then to where the relic rests. In Catholic tradition, they practice what is called the Stations of the Cross, an almost reenactment of the crucifixion itself.
No, it's surprising and beautiful to see how many different ways there's intersections between the Stations of the Cross, which Christian tradition remembers, and then what science perceives on the Shroud of Turin. So, for example, in Jerusalem, you might see that X marks the spot. 3 times Jesus fell here and here and here. Again, it's not in the scripture, but on the shroud, there are traces of soil, and this soil is gathered precisely on the feet and at the nose and at the knee. One geologist says that this soil matches the soil of the grottos of Jerusalem like a fingerprint, and is precisely there where you would expect contact with the ground. And so it's quite believable, on the basis of the shroud alone, that this man fell and fell 3 times. There are other ways too in which the Stations of the Cross map onto what we see on the shroud. So for example, Jesus is said to carry his cross, or patibulum. That's what we read about in history, that he carried his crossbeam. Do you know that on the right shoulder and then further down and closer to the spine, we have 2 excoriations on the back, one 10 centimeters square, showing how the rough wood would have scraped against the skin. This is evidence that this victim, the one that lies in the tomb now, wrapped in this burial shroud, previously bore some weight on his right shoulder, exactly as the scriptures and Christian tradition remembers.
Ma allora, non diamolo per un risultato già certo e già dimostrato. Si tratta di esaminare un oggetto come quando si fa un'indagine poliziesca, quando si ha di fronte un caso e si vuole cercare di risolverlo. Poniamoci da questo punto di vista. E allora è chiaro che non possiamo dimenticare che la tradizione lo identifica con il lenzuolo di Gesù di Nazareth, ma qualcuno afferma e è convinto che si tratti del lenzuolo che può aver avvolto il corpo di un altro uomo, vissuto nel passato, oppure che si tratti di un dipinto fatto da un pittore il quale ha voluto raffigurare la morte di Gesù e poi l'ha fatto credere essere il vero telo originario. Ecco, siamo di fronte a queste opzioni. Ma allora oggi cosa possiamo dire? Beh, forse un po' di tempo fa non avevano le conoscenze per poter dare delle risposte certe. Oggi in parte le abbiamo.
One and the same body are covered by 1, the headcloth, and 2, the shroud. And so that's important for a number of reasons. One is to just identify the truth of the gospel claim, and then also is to say, okay, what did this man suffer? What can we deduce from the bloodstains? So for example, the proportion of water to blood shows evidence of lung edema. Someone who has been brutally beaten or scourged would suffer in just this way. Blood flows out once you move from the vertical position to the horizontal position, out of the nose and mouth, and now saturating the beard, so that when you fold this cloth, and we get this detail, the sudarim was folded separately. Indeed, we find a folded cloth that when opened up bears a double image of a face.
Ebbene, scelse una serie di caratteristiche comuni e si chiese: qual è la probabilità che un qualunque crocifisso della storia, uno dei tanti, può aver avuto su di sé tutte contemporaneamente queste caratteristiche comuni all'uomo della sindone e a Gesù di Nazareth. E alcune di esse sono piuttosto normali, ma altre sono veramente eccezionali. Il fatto di un casco di spine sulla testa è l'unico caso della storia che conosciamo.
E che cosa ci dicono in relazione alla sindone? La sindone ci dice di più.
The evidence keeps piling up. Not only was Jesus crucified, as the Gospels say, he was also buried, as the Gospels say. And that's a hugely important step, because if he hadn't been buried, as some proposed, not that many years ago, or left hanging on the cross, or maybe pitched into a ditch and dogs ate his body, well, then you're not going to have a shroud. For as all we know, they believe this is the burial shroud of Jesus. And you look at it, and it's somebody who's been crucified according to the way the gospel said he was crucified. Not every person crucified has a crown of thorns jammed on their head. Not everybody crucified has a spear thrust in his side.
Jesus was brutally beaten ahead of time with the scourging. Of course, we know that he was in chains that night, so that he's so debilitated by the time he's already carried the cross, and after his scourging and the crowning with thorns, and he is dead within a matter of hours.
The source of radiation coordinates with the blood stains, produces this image, and what does it show at the end of the day? Not just evidence of the blood and the crucifixion, not just evidence of the resurrection through the radiation that's coming from a dead body, which never happens, but a correlation with the gospel accounts of the crucifixion that is absolutely remarkable.
Belief is usually formulated by our worldviews, not by our facts. And it's a pretty well-known fact. There are exceptions, but it's a pretty well-known fact. If your worldview does not allow this data, for example, are you crazy? You're talking about the supernatural world. We all know there's no supernatural world. No, you said that. I didn't, and we all don't agree.
Eerie familiarity comes over me as I gaze upon the image of the man on the cloth, now in 3D form. A connection, an instinct. I know something. That encounter with the shroud fuels a fire to unveil the truth, to uncover the identity of the man.
There's two major theories for the light source, which in physics we call radiation. The first is what's called vacuum ultraviolet radiation, and this would be columnated, that is to say very directional, very straight directional. The cloth is falling down flat, and what you would have to do is generate 6 to 8 billion watts of vacuum ultraviolet radiation, which would be, well, like 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy coming from this body. Now, of course, dead corpses never do this sort of thing, but if you get 500,000 searchlights worth of light energy for 1/40 billionth of a second, you're going to have to use some kind of laser device, like an ARF excimer laser. And if you did that, you would have to exceed all the ultraviolet technology that we have in the world today, in every laboratory in the world today, to produce that one image for 1/40 billionth of a second. Doubtful.
Without the chance to see the shroud face to face, I want to return to the crime scene, where the shroud was first kept. My journey takes me to the Holy Land.
You have to remember the head of the Sanhedrin, and most of the members of the Sanhedrin didn't believe in resurrection. They're Sadducees, unlike the Pharisees. And so, for sure, they didn't want anybody running around claiming he's risen from the dead. That's just not going. And so we have the story about the stone. In Matthew, we even have a story about guards on the tomb.
The main thing is to make sure two things don't happen. One, nobody takes the body anywhere. And number two, there is no public lamentation. There's not going to be crowds. You know how it is now. Some celebrity dies and people are putting candles and cards and ribbons and tokens of grief. It turns into a shrine. That's not going to happen.
It's Mary Magdalene who is there early in the morning and is weeping at the side of the tomb, and she discovers that it's empty, and so she says, "They've taken away my Lord."
They're not thinking, "Oh, he must be resurrected." They're not thinking that. They're thinking, his body's been moved. This was not the criminal tomb set aside for executed people that the Sanhedrin oversees. This is a private tomb. They know that. They saw where he was buried. They know Joseph Arimathea put his body there.
The Gospels describe when people go into the tomb and find that Jesus is not there, it does say that the burial clothes were there. And it's the way that the Gospel writers have to really emphasize the body really was not there. The clothes were there, the body's not there.
They have to go to say, we don't know where he is, we don't know where the body is, until they now bump into Jesus on the way. And there's the encounters. If you go to Turin to this day, you will see the way the church treats the shroud. It's written right there, embroidered on the very case of the shroud. It says, "We venerate your shroud as we contemplate your passion," it says. And so there's the shroud has been seen as a mirror of the gospel. And yet it doesn't pronounce dogmatically as to whether this particular relic is that linen which wrapped the historical body. It leaves scientific questions, empirical questions, to scientists, to empiricists. By all means, laboratories, do your thing, because we have the confidence that faith and reason are not incompatible. They are mutually illuminating. They go together.
The Apostle Paul once wrote, "Follow me as I follow Christ," as if something could only be discovered by walking in the steps of another. I would run the experiment. My thought was, if I could retrace the actions and match them with the evidence on the shroud, I might discover something new.
What is crucifixion? Crucifixion is the summum supplicium. It's the worst of all punishments that the Romans devised so as to communicate to all, don't do what this guy did or get ready to suffer the same thing.
I'm aware that in some small way the challenges I face mirror those of the man I've come to understand. Transcending the moment, or even time and space. Research intertwines with personal experience, reshaping my perspective on the case itself. All I could think of carrying that cross was how narrow the streets were. How many faces would have been watching him? How shaming. Maybe by performing those final acts, he was answering his own question. Who do you say I am? I ascended into the Holy Sepulchre, where legend suggests Jesus' cross stood and his body was buried. Like the story of Jesus himself, my journey had its moments of suffering and apparent death, only to emerge again. It wasn't just a crime scene. The shroud seemed to be a signpost pointing to something unexplained, like the cross in the tomb. I contemplated Jesus' words. He who has seen me has seen the Father. Maybe in some small way, I too bore testimony to my Father's life, and he lived on in me. That was enough to keep me going. It was time to return home and build my case. But even with all the evidence, including Bible testimony and scientific testing, this was a case intertwined with faith and never completely closed. What kept it open was the baffling question. How did one criminal who died in shame on a cross, the victim of powerful forces, become the light of the world for so many?
The reason why people frequently use the term the greatest story ever told is because it's the most unexpected story that somebody who was crucified on a Roman cross in ignominy, shame, agony would become the most famous person in civilization through the story that's told about him. That's why it's the greatest story ever told, because where else do you have somebody who was crucified as a criminal becoming so important, a would-be king figure? That's just unprecedented.
This is a person who was brutally murdered, but for some reason, they saved this shroud for centuries and took care of it. And why?
One of the things about the shroud that makes it so fascinating is that in one object, it tells the gospel story. Because you have this figure who has been scourged, who has been crucified, who's had a crown of thorns placed on him, who's had a spear in his side. So in one object, you're seeing a whole gospel story.
Because they not only believed it belonged to the historical Jesus, but they believed it was evidence, not only of his death, but of his resurrection. The image on the shroud as a negative image is an image of a person who rose from the dead.
But I see no natural explanation right now. I certainly don't see any natural explanation for how 6 to 8 billion watts of vacuum ultraviolet radiation can emanate from a corpse either.
I should add that I'm not a skeptic on philosophical or metaphysical grounds. That is, given my worldview, it would be possible for this to be some amazing thing from the first century. I'm just not convinced that it is.
Worldviews determine what we believe more than facts do.
This is not just any old artifact or relic or something that we might have some curiosity about or something. This could go right to the heart of the Christian message.
There's no empirical proof that tells you this and only this is the one and only meaning that's here. We bring our past, we bring our patrimony, we bring our traditions, we bring our sufferings. And when we see the face of Christ, I think we see something of our own story.
A boy not more than 10 years old said, the scientists could not admit that Jesus resurrected and did a selfie with the shroud. Why not? The child had the solution. The selfie of Jesus is the shroud.
As we venture forth, remember, every lens shift is an invitation to explore, to question, and to appreciate the complexity of existence. Much like peering into the human soul, we unveil layers of truth and vulnerability, unveiling a deeper understanding of what it means to be human.
Is that the question that began this journey? Is that
I think the subtitle is a giveaway because it's the shroud face to face. Because I think what you're really asking is to look into the mirror, because on some level, however you view Jesus, Jesus plays the role for Western culture as being the mirror looking back. So to the degree that you judge who Jesus is, you're judging yourself.
I love that.